For 40 years, we've been told the same thing. Violent video games are turning kids into violent people. And honestly, it feels obvious. Almost every time there's a horrible tragedy, someone points at a game controller. But there's just one problem with that story. As games got bloodier, more realistic, and sold by the literal billions, youth violence didn't rise to match it. In fact, it fell. So what on earth is actually going on here? Now, this is not some fringe corner of science. The link between games and violence is one of the most heavily studied questions in all of psychology, with hundreds of papers stretching back decades. So we don't have to guess, and we don't have to go with our gut. We can just follow the actual evidence, one step at a time. And the very first clue is something most people completely miss. We have run this exact movie before, many, many times. Go back to the 1950s. Back then, the villain wasn't video games, it was comic books, and before comics, it was pulp novels. Then the radio, then rock and roll music, and then television. Every single new medium that young people fall in love with eventually gets accused of corrupting them. The comic book panic was huge. A psychiatrist wrote a best-selling book claiming comics were breeding a generation of delinquents, and it triggered actual hearings in the United States Senate. The industry got so scared of being banned that it created its own censorship code. Today, the idea that Superman comics were producing criminals just seems silly. Because the pattern is impossible to ignore. The medium keeps changing. Comics, rock, TV, games. But the panic is always, word for word, the same. And that tells you something important. A scary feeling about a new technology is not, by itself, evidence that it's actually harmful. But wait, you might be thinking. There really are studies, lots of them, showing that violent games increase aggression. And that is completely true. They exist. So the honest question isn't whether those studies exist. It's this: how exactly did they measure aggression in the first place? And here is where it gets strange. In a laboratory, you obviously cannot ethically make a person commit real violence. So researchers rely on stand-ins, little proxies for aggression. In one classic setup, you get to blast another person with a burst of loud, unpleasant noise. In another, you decide how much painfully hot sauce to serve a stranger after being told that this person hates spicy food. And then, more hot sauce gets recorded as more aggression. Once you see it, you can't unsee the problem. Squeezing a sauce bottle is simply not the same thing as hurting a human being. And scientists have shown these tests are often run and analyzed in inconsistent ways, which can quietly inflate the results. Lab aggression is just not real-world violence. Quick question before we keep going. Were you ever told that video games would make you violent? Or maybe you said it about someone else? Drop a comment below, I actually read them. Now, to be fair, the scientists themselves don't all agree on this. One camp argues there is a small but real measurable effect, and we shouldn't brush it off. Another camp argues the effect is so tiny and so tangled up with flawed methods that it's basically meaningless for real life. It's a genuine debate. But notice, even the side that believes in an effect is talking about small, lab-measured aggression, not real violence. And it gets more interesting still. Over the last decade, psychology went through what's now called the replication crisis. A lot of famous, textbook findings simply stopped holding up once other scientists tried to reproduce them carefully. The violent games research got pulled right into that storm. Early reviews that pooled the studies together did find an effect, but even then it was small. So researchers got stricter. They began pre-registering their predictions publicly before collecting any data, so they couldn't quietly fish for a result. And when a large, pre-registered study did exactly that, the link between violent games and real-world aggression shrank to essentially zero. Which brings us to the single biggest test of all. Not a lab, not a questionnaire, reality itself. Think about the scale here. Video games went from a niche childhood hobby to a nearly $200 billion global industry played by billions of people. If violent games genuinely manufactured violent humans, we would expect a matching wave of violence in the real world. Instead, the opposite happened. In the United States, youth violent crime fell sharply from the 1990s onward, and the countries that game the very most, like Japan and South Korea, have some of the lowest violent crime rates on the entire planet. And this isn't just an internet argument. In 2011, it reached the United States Supreme Court after California tried to ban selling violent games to children. The court struck the law down, and looking right at the research, the justices wrote that these studies do not prove that violent video games cause minors to act aggressively. So if the evidence is this shaky, why won't the myth die? Part of the answer is human. After something horrific, people desperately want a simple, satisfying explanation, and a violent game is the perfect villain. For a politician, pointing at a game is easy and safe. For the news, it's a dramatic story that writes itself. The boring truth that there's no clear link just doesn't sell as well. So what do the actual experts say today? The American Psychological Association reviewed the entire field and landed on a very careful line. Yes, there is some evidence that violent games can nudge up minor, short-term aggression, like being a bit irritable right after you play. But, and this is the crucial part, they explicitly said there is not enough evidence to link those games to real-world violence or to criminal behavior. And to be clear, none of this means games are magically perfect. Spending 16 hours a day on anything is a problem, and some people really do struggle with how much they play. Those are real conversations. But that is a completely different claim from the scary one we started with. So let's put the whole picture together. Violent games can leave you a little wound up for about 10 minutes, the same way that losing a tense board game can. What they do not do is take an ordinary person and turn them into a violent one. The panic was never really about the data. It was about adults being frightened of something new that they didn't understand. Okay, 3 quick things before you go. First, what surprised you the most? The hot sauce experiment or the Supreme Court? Tell me in the comments. Second, if this gave you the real evidence instead of the scary headline, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this reach more people. And third, subscribe. Because that is the whole point of this channel. Myths checked against the actual data.